In today's hectic and demanding society, we often find ourselves feeling overwhelmed, anxious, and stressed. It's reported that over a quarter of the population are suffering from serious stress at any time, and 51% of adults who felt stressed reported feeling depressed, and 61% reported feeling anxious. Of the people who said they felt stressed at some point in their lives, 16% had self-harm and 32% said they had had suicidal thoughts and feelings. These are alarming statistics. Stress is a big issue in our lives. The triggers of stress may be small, or it may be a huge event in our lives. It can come from one or many possible sources. And overcoming stress can be difficult. And if the stress is ongoing or chronic, it can slowly drain away our joy in life, our energy, and our feelings of purpose and fulfillment. When the body finds stress debilitating, when it cannot handle the emotional overload of conflict and stress, it simply lets us know by not functioning at its best. We may feel tired and fatigued. We may try to find ways to help ourselves or even look for an escape. But is there a way to handle stress in our lives? And if so, what is the best way to deal with stress? Well, join me as we chat with Dr. Delia, a specialist in nutritional neuroscience, who is going to share with us what is happening in our bodies and brains when we are stressed. Stress. It's something we all experience. It can come from conflict in our relationships, both family and friends, our health, our finances, our school or workplace. It's all around us. And we all want to know the best way to deal with the stress in our lives. Our guest today, Dr. Delia, is a psychologist and neuroscientist who has focused on nutrition in the brain for over 2 decades. Delia holds a PhD from Adelaide Medical School and is the author of 2 successful books. Delia, welcome to our program today. We're delighted that you can be with us to share your latest research on how our brains deal with stress and the best way to cope with it.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Gary.
So let's get right to the heart of the topic. What is stress?
Well, firstly, Gary, stress isn't all bad. If we didn't have a little bit of good stress, we wouldn't be here today. Good stress gets us out of bed, keeps us motivated to pursue our goals, and helps us live a good life. The bad kind of stress is an insidious stress, a stress that lasts for a long period of time. So let's use an example. Imagine we're wandering through the forest. It's a beautiful day. The sun is shining, the birds are singing, and we're having a lovely chat. But suddenly, we hear a rustle in the bushes. And before we can think about it, we're running away from that sound to get away from a possible threat, which could have been a tiger. Now, the stress response was only supposed to last from between 30 to 60 seconds. Because let's face it, the tiger either got you in that time frame, or otherwise you escaped the tiger and you didn't need to have that stress anymore. But in today's world, our overwhelming, very complicated world, that stress response is lasting for a whole lot longer than 30 to 60 seconds. And then we call it chronic stress. It's going on for a long period of time and it's causing a lot of problems in our body and our brain. And we call that a psychological stress, but it has the same effect on our body as if we were busy running away from a tiger.
So what actually happens in our body and our brain when we feel stressed?
It's interesting because there are a lot of things that happen very, very quickly. So within the brain, our hypothalamus quickly talks to our memory to say, hey, have we felt this stress before? Then the message goes to the pituitary gland, which then tells the adrenal glands to pump out adrenaline, which then tells glucose to be sent to our muscles to run away or fight the tiger. We call that the HPA axis, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. So it's a little bit complicated, but the primary aim is to get us away from that threat. The challenge is that today our threats are all psychological. Most of us are not running away from tigers, and it's an insidious, ongoing, slow burn of adrenaline and cortisol, which are our stress hormones, which cause so much damage.
So Delia, how does stress affect what we eat?
Well, when we think about what stress is getting us to do, to run away from the tiger, what most people do is reach for something that will give them a quick rise in blood glucose, and they become accustomed to doing that. That becomes a habit. So that's lollies, carbonated drinks with lots of sugar in them, coffee gives a jolt of energy, and other highly refined and processed foods. When that becomes a habit, the blood glucose becomes very, very unstable. And then you set up another stress response because the body responds in a stressful way when our blood glucose becomes unbalanced as well. So it's like a double negative in relation to what happens in the body and why people choose highly processed foods. Because guess what? The highly processed foods are quickly absorbed and then the person needs another energy hit.
So are there nutrients that we run out of when we feel stressed all the time?
Absolutely. What most people don't realize, Gary, is that stress is very, very expensive from a nutritional perspective because adrenaline and cortisol demand nutrients to be synthesized, to be created. And many of those nutrients are the same nutrients that are required for energy production. That's why when people feel stressed all the time, they also feel very tired because the body and brain is prioritizing survival, the stress hormone production, over energy production. So we end up being deficient in, for example, B vitamins, vitamin C, magnesium, zinc, selenium, many of those nutrients that are not in processed food. So you can see the perfect storm here. Chronic stress leads to a desire for highly processed foods that lead to a quick rise in blood glucose and increased stress, but don't contain the nutrients that, for example, we have around us in this kitchen, these superfoods. These are foods that are whole foods. They've got a lot of fiber in them, which looks after the gut. They're full of the nutrients required to make both stress hormones and the neurotransmitters that we need to stay calm and help the brain function well. People don't understand that when we're really stressed, the demand for nutrients goes up because we need to keep on making these stress hormones. But in the same way, we also still need those nutrients to make serotonin and melatonin, which helps us go to sleep. So there's a very important reason why when we're really stressed, our diet needs to be even better than under normal circumstances.
Now, when you say better, you mean more of these natural, plant-based foods. They provide the best nutrients to assist us when we're under stress.
Yes, and the important thing to keep in mind, these are not just nutrients for our brain, they're also nutrients for our body because our body is also under extra pressure when we're stressed. We know that stress leads to things like cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and other health challenges, including putting on weight. So we are nourishing our whole body and our brain when we're under chronic stress eating this way.
Delia, why do people put on weight when they're stressed?
Well, the first obvious answer is that they naturally gravitate to highly refined foods. They don't keep them full for very long, but are full of dead and nutrient-deficient calories. So they eat more of the kinds of food that lead to weight gain. The second reason is a little bit more insidious because when blood glucose rises and dips a lot, what happens is that the body says to itself, this person's having a bit of a challenge. Maybe they're going to run out of food. And then the body starts storing any excess carbohydrates as fat. And most people don't realize that because that's just a simple biochemical response that happens from too much refined foods, too much stress, and blood glucose going haywire. But the third reason is really rather sobering. And the reason why a lot of the fat that people put on gravitates to our belly region. Cortisol is a very insidious and sneaky stress hormone because what it does, it also stimulates the release of specific enzymes that tell the body to store fat. And because there are 4 times more cortisol receptors in our belly region, we end up with more fat gravitating to that area. It's like our belly region is a magnet for fat when we're experiencing chronic stress. So those are 3 reasons why people naturally start putting on weight when they're stressed. A psychological reason is because when people are really stressed, they're looking for comfort and they're looking for feeling good from an emotional perspective. And often they gravitate to foods that lead them to feel that sense of comfort. The challenge is that many of those foods, especially the highly refined, very sugary foods, also lead to something very interesting happening in the body. This is the release of what we call endogenous opioids. These are natural compounds that the body makes to calm us down. So for example, you're really stressed, you feel uptight, you can't control the circumstances you're in, you feel overwhelmed, and what do? You gravitate to something highly refined because you need energy, but you also want to calm down. And these kinds of food lead to a natural reduction in that cortisol response. So people become addicted to those kinds of foods because it leads them to feel calm and relaxed, which they don't realize is happening, but is actually happening under the hood.
Does stress have any impact on our digestion?
Yes, definitely. When you're busy running away from a tiger or you feel threatened all the time, your body doesn't have time to digest food. It's too busy trying to get you away from that threat. So all those beautiful digestive enzymes that should be functioning and digesting and helping the absorption of the food stop working well. The gut bacteria become compromised because cortisol affects their production, their proliferation, and affects how healthy they keep that beautiful gut wall. So stress definitely impacts our digestion. It can stop, and many people report feeling much more sensations of bloatedness, having an incapacity to have their food move through their body, just battling generally to digest their food, simply because stress says, hold on a second, gut health doesn't matter, getting away from the tiger is the priority.
Delia, is the damage caused by stress limited to digestion?
Absolutely not. Unfortunately, all this production of these stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol, impact our endocrine system, which is our hormonal system as well. It basically stops our hormonal system from functioning optimally, so women will find themselves really battling when they're in their reproductive years with hormone fluctuations and challenges in that area. Perimenopausal and menopausal women will start battling as well, and men even start battling with their levels of testosterone, simply because cortisol is the major disruptor of how the endocrine system functions. Now, when the endocrine system is messed with, it also affects sleep. And I'll just step back for a moment to give you an example of the complexity of this process. When we experience a lot of stress, for example, women's estrogen production is impacted because serotonin and estrogen work together. So that means the capacity to feel calm and relaxed, the capacity to fall asleep, and the capacity to synthesize melatonin, which comes from serotonin, is negatively compromised. And there's progesterone. Progesterone also fluctuates during the month, but becomes impaired in that fluctuation when cortisol is present. And that means that the neurotransmitter GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid, is also impacted. And we need that neurotransmitter to help us feel calm and relaxed. So those are just 2 examples of what happens when cortisol gets into the mix. That impacts sleep directly, because now we don't have serotonin being synthesized optimally, or melatonin. So we're not sleeping well. And we're also not sleeping well because we've got too many things going on in our head. You know, we've got those thoughts that go around and around. So we have this perfect storm of a hormonal imbalance and too much cortisol, and the psychological input of this overwhelm and stress that we feel that's making us lie awake at night and stare at the ceiling. So this ongoing chronic stress has a really very negative, insidious effect on every single one of our cells, not just on our brain.
Is there anything else that happens to our brain when we are chronically stressed?
Unfortunately, Gary, yes, something very insidious happens in the brain when we experience chronic stress. That ongoing cortisol synthesis actually starts changing the structure of a part of our brain called the limbic system. That part of our brain becomes incapable of keeping our emotions balanced. And this is where anxiety and depression steps in. So the structure of the brain starts shifting, and people find it really, really difficult to feel upbeat and happy. They start worrying a lot more. They feel anxious about everything, and they just generally feel low in mood. And that's because of what cortisol is doing to the actual structure of the brain. So ongoing stress is a really, really scary thing because of all the things it does to our endocrine system, to our sleep, and to this very, very important part of our brain that balances our emotions. So I'm not at all surprised that anxiety and depression rates are skyrocketing. We live in a very complex world where a lot of people feel out of control and a lot of overwhelm is present. And so the brain adjusts to that ongoing chronic stress with changing the way it deals with our emotions.
Is this then why people end up feeling exhausted after long periods of stress?
Yes, they do, because not just don't they have enough nutrients to be able to produce energy from a normal perspective, they're using loads and loads of nutrients to produce these stress hormones, but it's also exhausting dragging yourself around when you feel depressed and anxious. You know, you're spending a lot of energy to try and appear normal, to try and do all the things that you need to do, to try and function fully in the world, and people end up just feeling shattered. So this is why people have that feeling of being burnt out. They just wait for Friday and the weekend. They just can't drag themselves out of bed anymore. It's not just the nutrients that they're lacking, they're also lacking the capacity to show up as their best selves because they're battling from an emotional perspective.
Delia, you mentioned highly refined and processed foods that we tend to gravitate to when we're under a lot of stress. What about these foods, the natural foods? How do they affect our stress levels? How do they impact us when we're under stress?
Well, Gary, that's a great question because these foods are full of unrefined carbohydrates. They've got good protein in them, and we've got great fats here. Here we've got flaxseed, hemp seeds, chia seeds, beautiful fat that the brain needs for its structure and its function. We need great carbohydrates to provide the energy for the brain. Now remember, when the brain is running on chronic stress all the time, it's needing extra energy and extra nutrients. So we're providing the energy here, and we're also providing the nutrients. One of the biggest mistakes that people make when they're under stress is they believe that their high cholesterol levels are related to something that has nothing to do with stress. Let's just get something really, really clear. To be able to synthesize cortisol, the body needs cholesterol. Cholesterol is the raw material of cortisol. So what happens when we're very stressed? The body has to create more cholesterol so that it can create cortisol. Now, what counteracts that? Fiber. Fiber counteracts that, because if we don't have enough fiber, we end up reabsorbing the cholesterol that we're producing, and we end up with high cholesterol levels. So these foods don't just provide all the right nutrients for the brain to function well, you know, to make neurotransmitters and the structure. They're providing fantastic energy to keep the blood glucose stable, which we want, especially when we're under stress. They're providing loads of vitamin C, which we use up in vast quantities, both in our brain and our adrenal glands when we're stressed. And they're providing fiber, which makes sure that the excess cholesterol we're synthesizing gets flushed out of our bowel. So these kinds of superfoods really nourish the brain at a very, very deep level, regardless of stress. But when stress is present, they do even a better job because they're supplying everything the brain needs to create the stress hormones and to allow us to feel calm and relaxed via things like serotonin and melatonin.
So it's a rather simple way to deal with our stress, or one of the ways that we can deal with our stress is simply by making sure that we eat a lot of natural plant-based foods.
Yes, because then we can make both stress hormones, which we absolutely need, but we can also make the neurotransmitters that we need to calm us down, allow us to sleep, and allow us to think clearly. And guess what? We make better decisions when we eat these kinds of foods. And that's one of the things we also need to focus on. What else can we do to help us cope in this really stressful world?
What's the answer? What else can we do?
One of the things that I teach people to do is to really be very, very sure about what their values are. When we know what our values are, we know what to prioritize. Then we know what to ignore. What's happening to people in today's world? It is a very complicated and sophisticated society that we've all created, and there's so much to pay attention to. When we try and pay attention to everything, what happens is that we lose sight of our goals, we lose sight of what drives us, what gives us meaning, and so we start prioritizing everything. One of the biggest problems and the feeling that people have associated with stress is not having enough time. When you know what your values are, you know what your priorities are, and you focus on those. You're not watching the news full of bad stories. You're not focusing on what negative people have to say. You're focused on making your world a better world. And just with that simple mindset shift, we reduce our stress enormously.
So do you have any other tips for dealing with stress? Surely you've got some top tips.
I do. One of them is really focusing on sleep. You know, when we sleep, our brain cleans itself. And if we're not getting enough sleep, when we wake up in the morning, we're not refreshed. We're dragging ourselves around because our brain is really tired. So focusing on sleep is very important. And that automatically means no news watching at night, switching off. Having sleep triggers like smelling some lavender oil, making sure you're reading a calm, relaxing book at night, not a book full of mayhem and chaos. Making sure you have a bath, maybe with some magnesium flakes in it, just to relax your body. Because you see, we need to handle stress from both a psychological and a physiological perspective. So it needs to be a mindset shift, and we need to supply our brain with what it needs to be able to function really well. But another thing that I tell people that are really feeling completely overwhelmed is to do a brain dump. Get a big piece of paper and write down every single thing that is bothering them. From beginning to end, a huge brain dump of the problems. And then what they do, they sift through those problems. So you need maybe an hour or two, and they put 2 columns down on a piece of paper. And everything that they can control, they write in the I can control column, and everything that they can't control, they ignore. Then they tear up that mind dump piece of paper and they only focus on what they can control. And you see, something interesting happens here, Gary, because if you've done the values assessment first, you know what your values are, and suddenly it becomes a lot clearer about what you can control and what you need to prioritize. So we need to feed our brain and body these kinds of foods, these superfoods, and we also need to get our mindset right.
Delia, it's been a pleasure to have you on our program today, and you've certainly given us lots of food for thought, much to think about. Love those tips that you've shared with us. So thank you very much, and I'd like to take this opportunity to wish you all the very best in your future endeavors. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gary. It was a delight.
Stress can come from anywhere at any time. Work, family, finances, school, relationships, conflict, or loss of a loved one. In fact, just about anything can be a source of anxiety in your daily life. And during times of uncertainty and stress, life can even seem more overwhelming than ever. We all try to find ways to ease our fears and deal with stress during tough times. Some may turn to medicine, others therapy, meditation, or others pray to God and read the Bible to ease their anxiety. Let's see how 2 Bible characters dealt with stressful situations. Jonah, a prophet of God, was to deliver a message to the people of Nineveh, the capital of Assyria. Jonah was afraid to go to Nineveh. He was unwilling to deliver the message, was stressed out about how he would be received, and so decided to run away on a ship bound for Tarshish, a place in the opposite direction. During a terrible storm on the sea, the sailors were afraid. Jonah told them that he is running away from God, so he should be thrown overboard into the sea. It was in Jonah's darkest hour, in a most stressful circumstance, in the belly of a whale, that he said this, "In my distress, I called to the Lord, and he answered me." In his time of great stress and anxiety, when those stress levels were right up, Jonah found comfort and peace by praying to God. David also knew all about stress. He had conflicts with King Saul, battles with neighboring nations, and the pressures of leading his own people. The Psalms, written by the shepherd boy who became King David, are full of references of turning to God, seeking Him and finding Him in times of conflict and intense stress. In my distress, I called to the Lord. I cried to my God for help. From His temple He heard my voice. My cry came before Him into His ears. And how about this one? And I called on the Lord in my distress, and He answers me. So David also found that spending time with God and speaking to Him in prayer brought peace and comfort. Stress places a huge demand on our bodies and on our faith in God at times. But God can use the stress in our lives to strengthen our trust in Him. God is always there, always watching over us. All we have to do is ask Him for help. If you would like to find out more about how stress affects the brain and ways that we can find a faith in God, then I'd like to recommend the free gift we have for all our incredible journey viewers today. It's the booklet, Introduction to Stress Solutions. This booklet is our gift to you and is absolutely free. I guarantee there are no costs or obligations whatsoever. So make the most of this wonderful opportunity to receive your free gift today.
Phone or text 0436 333 555 in Australia or 020 422 2042 in New Zealand or 770 800 0266 in the United States, or visit our website tij.tv or simply scan the QR code on your screen and we'll send you today's free offer totally free of charge and with no obligation. You can also write to us at the addresses on your screen or email us at info@tij.tv. Don't delay, call or text us now.
Be sure to join us again next week when we will share another of life's journeys together. Until then, let's pray to the great God who created us and who provides us peace in our busy lives. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you that we can reach out to you during the stressful times in our lives, when our hearts are troubled, when our minds are in turmoil and we are overwhelmed. Grant us your peace and give us the strength to follow your ways. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.